I hope you all enjoyed lunch. We're going to get started right now with From A to Z. This is about Cyan Ventures' first publishing project, partnered with Chuck Carter and Eager Games to publish Z, which came out a few months ago, I believe, June 4th. And Blake, take it away.
Yeah, thanks. Can everybody hear me now? All the way to the back. Now? Louder, louder? How are we doing? Okay, great. Well, I'm Blake Lewin. I'm head of business development for Cyan. And I'm going to let everybody else kind of give a little background. I saw a lot of hands raised up this morning that first-time Mysterium people, so that's pretty exciting. So I don't want to make any assumptions about who knows whom. So Chuck, why don't you introduce yourself, and then we'll go straight down the line here.
Okay, hi, I'm Chuck Carter. I own Eager Games, and I was one of the two artists on Myst originally, years and years ago. Woo! So Myst essentially started my career in games, and I've worked on numerous other games with many other companies like Westwood Studios and Electronic Arts and a variety of other companies. And I created a game called Z, which is what this is about, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today.
Excellent. Neal?
Hi, I'm Neal Laurenza. I'm the managing director at SkyMap Games. We are a contract development services company that specializes in helping studios make games. We're out in Manchester, New Hampshire. Also a big Myst fan, been around since the days of Cyan Chat when it was back on like a Java applet that you had to get on your old school web browser. Yeah, so pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Neal. Katie?
Hi, I'm Katie. I think some of you know me, but for those who don't, I've been a Myst fan since 1995, I guess, and we jumped into Cyan Chat in 2001, and the rest is history. We came to the first Mysterium here in Spokane in 2003, and I offered to help with community management, and I didn't know that would lead to a job at Ubisoft working with Myst Worlds on Myst 4 and 5 and Uru, and then was asked back for the Myst 25th anniversary, and have been kind of working on and off with Ryan and the team since, doing community and social media. Yay! I'm really happy to be back.
And Mr. Warzecha.
Okay, my name's Ryan Warzecha, a longtime fan, been around here for quite a while. Producer on Abduction, but now new role as head of business development, business relations, developer relations at Cyan Ventures. So,
right on.
Yeah, this is our new thing. This is exciting. Z is our first product, and we will have more. And yeah, excited to talk about it for sure.
Excellent. So let me see a show of hands. How many people even know what Z is?
Okay,
good.
That's the one.
Nice.
Right there. All right. So just a quick background. Cyan Ventures is something that we've talked about at Cyan for a while. We've been very, very blessed to have a community, huge audience like you guys. And so Cyan Ventures is really, we wanted to start giving back. Rand, if anybody couldn't guess, is really big on VR. I mean, it's kind of his career, kind of looks like it was moving towards that from the very beginning. But he also wants to see other people get involved. We're in the early stages of VR, and so there's a lot that still needs to be discovered. So Cyan Ventures wants to give a little bit of money to some talented folks like Chuck so that their voices can be heard. And Ryan will talk more about it, but we're starting to become more of a publisher on that side of things. So Cyan Ventures, you can think of it as the publishing arm of Cyan, not at all related to the games that we will continue to produce as Cyan Worlds. Yeah. So with that, Chuck was our first, and you know, we have a saying in our house, the first pancake, and the first pancake has a lot of issues with it. You get going.
Bubbles in it, and gets burned on one side.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's the A to Z is a great thing. So we want to have an open, honest conversation about this. But what I want to start with is Chuck, the inspiration for Z. Where did it come from, and how long have you been working on this, and take it from there.
Z essentially started out as, has anybody heard of the manhole?
Mm-hmm.
It was another Cyan project. That was like their first game that they had done, and I'd seen that, and it was a very big inspiration for me to want to get into games. For the first time in my life, I saw something where you could create a world that you could let other people explore. You know, as an artist, it was something that was like really very mind open, very, mind expanding. It's like I could make something and then using my imagination, let other people explore it. And Zed sort of originated back when I saw the manhole back in 1818. After my birthday 2 days ago, 1800 sounds about right. But after 1989, it was something that I saw, and I kind of had this idea, and I've been bubbling around in my brain for years. And I'd followed it up a few times before Myst came out, and then long after Myst had come out. And that's where Zed sort of started from, to be kind of a manhole-ish kind of thing. But then I wanted to do something, I wanted to bring a story into it. And a friend of mine who was an early mentor as an artist, I mean, I've made I made a career as an illustrator, doing animation, doing a bunch of different things before I got into games. And one of the things I did is a lot of cartooning and a lot of humorous illustration. And one of my early mentors, I found out he was dying about 10 years ago, and he was suffering from dementia. And I thought I'd go visit him, and he didn't remember who I was, and at least until the end, and he kind of sort of semi-remembered me. But he was pleasant enough, but he was a very frustrated man. He couldn't remember how to do his artwork. And it was something that sort of stuck with me through the years about this person wanting to touch a part of his own ability that he couldn't remember exactly how to do it. And it was very touching. And I thought that this is an interesting thing to put a story about, because I think a lot of people can identify with this sort of thing within their own families. And I had other people in my family members who've suffered from Alzheimer's and dementia. And so that's kind of where the story sort of originated from. And, so I wanted to tell that through dreams and through a narrative process that we used that eventually was developed into the game Zed. So that's where it started from.
That's great. And you did a Kickstarter, right? Before you came to us,
Yes.
There was a Kickstarter. You want to just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we were trying to raise just a little bit of money to help us get started with it through our Kickstarter. And, originally the game was going to be 4 levels that were more expansive, that told a story through sections of each level, as opposed to the way Zed eventually turned out. And it was probably scoped out a little larger than we had the ability to actually do. But during that process, we learned a lot about the game in the process of making the game, in the process of developing a larger video game, and discovered also that there's a lot of work that goes into making any game. I don't care how simple it is or how complex it is. There's a lot of development that takes a lot of man hours and a lot of man time, to be able to create something. And Zed, obviously, from Kickstarter to completion, went through a lot of those growing pains and changes. And a lot of the changes were due to financial considerations and eventually deciding on Cyan as our publisher. And it evolved from what it originally was supposed to be to what it eventually became. And it really isn't all that different except in the scope of it and maybe the little bit change in the gameplay and how we wanted to tell the story.
So Ryan, you want to talk a little bit about when Chuck first came to us? And,
Yeah, so
the
when
process?
Chuck came to us originally, it was a much larger game. I know that you had been talking to Rand at the time, and Rand kept on kind of coming to you and saying, we got to put it down, make it smaller and smaller. And then you guys partnered with SkyMap, which is Neal, and I think that helped a lot, because then you guys came back to us at some point, basically, and said, here's the new idea. And, you had the different levels, and it had just shrunk quite, not shrunk maybe in size, but more like Contained, yeah, exactly. And you had the gameplay loop, and you had the idea of what you wanted to tell in each different level. I think Neal can go on a little bit more of that, but after we received that back and we were able to see that, okay, SkyMap was involved, Eager Games was involved, we felt like we had a really good team at that point that we felt, okay, let's make this happen. So yeah.
That's a great segue. So Neal, you want to talk a little bit about how you got involved with Chuck?
Yeah, sure. I was actually introduced to Chuck through a student. I used to teach part-time game development classes at Southern New Hampshire University, and I had one student that was up in Maine, Chuck's neck of the woods, and had mentioned, hey, I'm interning with this guy who used to work on Myst, and my brain's like, I need to go and talk to this guy as fast as I can. So I ended up meeting Chuck. I want to say through one of the Boston game development meetups. And he told me the story of Zed, and I was really stricken by it. I hadn't heard of a game that had tried to explore that particular kind of subject matter before. My studio's worked on close to 30 games, and a lot of them are more shooters or games that are outside of the narrative, sort of light puzzler genre. And I felt it was an important story and one that needed to get told. So my studio came in and helped Chuck with some initial prototyping, left for a while, and then ended up actually coming back later when we engaged with Cyan and helped to get the game basically out the door, which was cool.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Neal. So we brought Kha'tie in towards the end of the project, but it was very, very critical because what we began to realize was this was a very difficult game. And again, even using game kind of doesn't set up what it is. So Kha'tie, if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I kind of jumped on when we were starting to think about marketing and announcing the timeline for launch and stuff. And yeah, it's really tricky because one of the things we all agreed on is that having Cyan behind it adds the Myst magic to it. And we thought, oh, our Myst fans will understand what we're trying to do. So even when we had Chuck talk about the fact that it was very, very different from Myst and Riven, it wasn't a game per se, it wasn't puzzles, it was more of an experience, and it's more of a journey through this mentor's memories and dreams, and a very poignant and beautiful experience. We thought, well, adding that Myst magic will be awesome, and unfortunately it did the opposite. People, when they saw it, they felt like they were going to get sort of a next generation Myst game, and that's not what it is. It's not a puzzle game. It's just more of an emotional journey. And so what we're doing now and why we're excited to have this panel here and talking to you guys about it is we've rebranded on Steam and GOG, and I'm not going to say too much about what else we have coming up. I'll let you guys do that. But we're talking about it in ways that we're trying to kind of find that niche, those niche players who would love this kind of experience. So we've reached out to some really interesting places like fans of what becomes of Edith Finch and fans of That Dragon Cancer, for example. People that have played those emotional journeys that aren't necessarily a game per se, but you want to experience what the game developers are trying to convey. And part of why I was so happy to be on board is because of how passionate, not just Chuck, but Ryan and Rand and Blake and everyone, Neal involved, really wanted to get this story out there and this experience out there. And I think one of the confusing parts too is people don't realize you don't need VR to play this. You can just play this on your PC. And so every time we see somebody playing it, I'm reminded why I'm attached to the project, because everybody that plays it, it's a one and done. You can sit through it in one sitting, and it's just beautiful. You walk away having been changed by the experience, and I think I love watching streamers play it because they're all impacted by it, and then the chat fills with people sharing experiences and sharing, their personal anecdotes about why it's meaningful for them. So
Yeah,
if you haven't played it, we hope you will.
I will say this too, as we build our ventures brand, it's not just about the experience or the game that we're making either. It's also about the people behind that. And so working with Chuck, working with Neal, and the people that we will be working with, it's all about their stories too, and about this process. And I mean, it's been awesome. I mean, tough at times. Both. I mean, we go back and forth, but at the same time, you get to know these people, and I think that's, as a brand, as Cyan Ventures, and especially with Rand, we want to work with really good developers, really good people, and that's important to us. So.
And we want to. I have a Gary Larson cup that's got what dogs here, and it's like blah 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 blah, ginger ginger blah blah blah, ginger blah ginger. So a lot of times the biggest problem we found was that when we started talking about Chuck's game, it was Myst, blah 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 blah, Myst, blah blah blah, Myst, Zed, blah blah blah, Myst. So it was, unfortunately, I think it set up expectations in terms of, oh, he worked on Myst, Cyan publishes Myst, it must be like Myst, but that missed the point. So, oh, that was bad.
I almost looked unintentional.
Yeah. But the point being is that as Kha'tie's working with us in not rebranding, but just re-explaining why we're doing what we're doing, and really, to Ryan's point, it is to allow artists like Chuck to get out there. Which brings up VR. So our interest in VR is also that it's a fresh medium. Myst sold CD-ROMs, probably sold more CD-ROMs than anything else. Not that we think Zed or any of our Cyan Ventures projects is going to sell that much, but it's a time of experimentation. Yeah. And so we're taking risks. Chuck's game in VR, if you play it in 2D, it's wonderful, but when you play it in VR, it becomes much more personal and intimate. And knowing Chuck, I mean, I see things, it's like, wow, this is Chuck's story when you're in VR, because you're living in the space that he created. The story's great, but the art really helps do that. So you want to talk a little bit about, in doing VR, what your thoughts were?
Right. For one thing, developing for both PC and VR proved a lot of challenges, but those challenges were secondary to wanting to tell the story. And the story that we wanted to tell was about this dreamer. And one of the things that we wanted to include within that framework of telling a story was to include the environment itself, that the places you're in the game, and in VR in particular, these really become much more evident because you're able to crouch down. I heard somebody talk about Starry Expanse, being able to look down at something closely and examine things. And in VR, you can do that. You can talk about, you can show things like, pictures and art and elements and items and things that you find in the dreamer's life, just like you do in real life when you're walking around your apartment or your house or room. You notice little things about that person. It's like, what kind of keys? Where do they put their keys when they first walk in the house? What kind of cups or mugs do they have? Different little detailed things that tell a little bit of a story about each of us. And I wanted Zed to be able to tell that same story along with the narrative, that you get a more of a robust feeling of who this person is, not only from the story that you're listening to through the narrative itself, but also through examining his life through the objects that he surrounded himself with and are reproduced in the dreams and in the worlds that you're exploring in the game itself. And VR is one of the few ways that you can really truly immerse yourself in that kind of storytelling that up until VR existed really at the level it is now, you really couldn't do that. I mean, 2D is a great way to show it, and it does show it in ways that we really tried to take advantage of how we developed the game, both from a visual perspective and everything else, to be able to be a really great experience and as a traditional game. But then in the VR thing, it gave us an opportunity to really kind of push how we actually present the world and the environments to people in the context of telling that story. And that was something that was a big challenge, but after, since I had the opportunity to work on a big chunk of the actual design and a lot of the artwork and placing all the elements in the worlds with a good team of other people that were helping along building these models and everything else, it gave me a chance to kind of really put myself into the world in a way that was a lot more personal for me, because there's a lot of elements in the game that become part of the story that are actually directly related to my life, which as an artist, it was kind of cool to be able to add, like, the house itself in the game. It's the house I grew up in, and I reproduced it almost exactly to the way it was that I grew up in it. But I wanted to use that to tell the story of the dreamer. And VR will actually put you in my brain in a way that, as I said earlier, when I thought the manhole, that was the sort of the start, the seed for being able to tell a story about somebody's, that's coming from your imagination as an artist. And Zed is really a big extension of that, where I can put you literally in the world in a VR setting in a way that was impossible just a few years ago. And so it's given us as developers a new tool to be able to tell stories in a way that has virtually been impossible. And so, that's something that we're still developing that experience to some degree, and I think it's only going to get better and more interesting as these systems become, much more available to people, and come down in price, and it expands outward as a way to play games.
That's right. No, it's interesting when you had.
Oh, sorry.
No, Neal, I wanted to go right to you and kind of have your input on and how bringing a game to VR, what obstacles or issues you came into.
Yeah, absolutely. I before I chat about that, though, I just want to mention that Chuck is a really interesting person to work with, because he's got this way of looking at the game in an extremely cohesive way. So a lot of the levels, there's details that people don't even really notice. For instance, almost every level has little bits and little trinkets and little objects that are actually bleeding in from other parts of the dreamer's mind. So you're looking around and you're actually seeing the deconstruction of the rest of the levels within each level. You'll notice something that doesn't happen until later, but there's a minor reference in the story that just happens to sync up as an object, to a piece of voiceover. So that's been really cool, like just to be able to see Chuck figure out really unique ways of telling his story through the environment. It's been pretty amazing. As far as technical difficulties, it's funny because when we sort of looked at the first iteration of Zed, this is probably a couple of years ago now, time flies, it was really heavy. The game was really massive and sprawling, and as a result, it was definitely not optimized. It was really difficult to be able to get that to run on the minimum specifications for virtual reality. And so one of the ideas of reducing the size of the levels and making the game more linear, in addition to the fact that it's, I think, a little bit easier to tell the story, it's also useful for performance. We don't have to worry about how many polygons we can be more careful about how many polygons we're pushing. We don't have a massive sprawling environment. If it's more contained, we're able to more effectively evaluate how the environment is performing and keep things constrained. So I think that was something that was a really good decision early on that we made. And one that I think has had a big effect on how we think about VR moving forward.
That's great, Neal. Ryan, you want to talk a little bit about our perspectives on VR and?
Yeah, it is a medium that Rand loves. I mean, at the studio, we're going to continue to go towards it. Firmament's going to have an amazing VR experience. These other things that we're talking about with other titles for with Numinous Games, I can say that actually. We're going to be working with Numinous Games on the next title for, I got to be careful how I say this, but yeah, for Ventures.
You've said too much already.
I know. But yeah, no, if it's not the Quest, if it's the Rift S, or if it's the Vive or the Index, we have a lot of hardware at work, and we continue to look at it, and it's where we want to go. So yeah.
And then, Kha'tie, in terms of our audience in VR, where do you see Zed growing? Because obviously it's a very different type of audience we need to go after, and our
Right.
missed audience obviously aligns well. But where do you see the audience for Zed?
Yeah, so I think part of why it resonates with so many Myst fans is because we have fans of every age. And one of the things that Chuck and I talk about a lot, whenever Chuck brings Zed to a local Comic-Con, or when we were at PAX, or when Ryan's showing it here, we find it appeals to every age. So there's really no barrier to entry that way. 5-year-olds have played through the whole thing. We've had 80-year-olds play through the whole thing. There's nobody that can't access it and can't relate to a lot of what's in it. Like I'm close to your age, and I find there's a lot of memories. Well, hands up if you've played it. Have you played Zed? Okay, so quite a few. So when you're in the worlds, how many of you have seen something that triggered your own memory of your either childhood or young adulthood in it? Like when you've come across, yeah, okay. So there's bits and pieces in there, and I think, oh, I had that. I had one of those when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s. Like I had that thing, or that was what our car looked like, or, oh, I remember trick-or-treating on a street just like that. So there's a lot of little instances, and that's what I think resonates with our mature, well-read audience for Myst or adventure games. But I think there are other audiences. Like we've had streamers who their first love is shooters or battle royale, and that's what they do 6 days a week. And then on Sunday evening or a Monday afternoon, they just want to chill out with a game, something like Zed. Like they're happy to play, a VR experience like that, and they love it. And they love it. Like they're not just going, where's my gun, or who can I kill, and where's the blood? They're literally saying, my grandma had that same phone, and that's the stuff that we want to hear. And that's why I think I'd love to be able to pluck out of the air who your perfect target audience is. But I think anybody who has a computer would enjoy it. Like it's just a life experience, and I think that's why it's so hard to kind of pin down who it's for.
Great. Yeah,
And
Ryan.
just talking to actually Shane, Philip yesterday. Sorry, Philip Shane. So just talking to him yesterday, and we were talking about all the footage that he's been taking, and of you, Chuck. And one of the things that
He
I want to
likes
see
you.
Ventures do more of is get your story out there, and that's kind of where I'm thinking, even in the future, like not only just having the game, but also having some sort of promotional where it's like a 10-minute of behind the artist, behind the story of Zed, just so that that's out there too, because it matters. That matters, because that'll add to the game, you know. Developer commentary, whatever you want to call it, it's something that matters, and that's where, again, I think Ventures wants things to go, is we don't want to just make games, we want to tell stories that matter.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, you're kind of expanding what's possible. That's what I like about pushing the boundaries of what you can do in the space.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. When you look at Zed, I know it's inspired by your mentor, but when you look back at Zed, I know you've put a lot of yourself in it, so it's almost, I don't know how to say it properly, but it's almost to me as if you weren't able to communicate or recall or share or use your talent, you have this out there now. People can know you through this game. Do you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
you've learned from your mentor what you don't want to have happen to you.
Yeah,
You
I mean,
don't want to have that same frustration. So now you have.
well, it's the
this.
idea of, you know, taking chances, finishing things, and don't let anything stand in your way. I mean, that's the primary message behind it, is that, you know, you may be tossed some really bad luck, or whatever you want to call it,
Right,
you know,
right.
throughout life. But the point is that there are important things in your life that you probably should take care of them sooner rather than wait till later. But if you are one of those people that wait till a certain point in your life when you're older, it's never too late to try to go back and try to repair or to leave something that as a positive influence on people. That was the primary message behind Zed. As awful as this guy's life was in some ways, he felt a lot of regret and wanted to redeem himself in some way. And I think that as a lesson just for individuals, that's a big thing. And I wanted to communicate that as well as I could.
Yeah, that's
Because really that's what the game is about.
Yeah.
You know, it's about trying to redeem himself, but that frustration of not being able to remember the things he needed to do.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm just saying it's probably never too late to do it before you become to that point in your life.
Zed is one of the most meta games. It's a story about someone it's a story about never giving up. And this game had every possible difficulty in trying to get it released and trying to get it developed. And that's exactly, like, it's really strange, because that's exactly what happened. Is Chuck, really, I give him a lot of credit, because he persevered through some craziness to try and get the game out, and we were there with him along that ride. And to make a game that is about not giving up, and at the same time be experiencing how crazy the game development roller coaster can be, is absolutely accurate. So yeah, I mean, I just think it's funny in that sense. There's the story really is relevant to life.
Yeah, it is. And having a really good girlfriend, you know, helping you out through this process helps a lot. Yeah, her picture's in the game too, by the way. So.
Yeah.
So that's great. So actually, Neal, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think one of the things would be good, Chuck, to share. When Ryan alluded to it, but when Chuck first came to us, we were like, yeah, Chuck. I think you got a little more work to do on this before you come back. So, I mean, even coming to us, it wasn't like first embrace. It was like, wow, you had this Kickstarter, you've been through a lot, the money's gone pretty much, and you've got this huge promise out there. How are you going to fulfill it? So you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing that hit us was we had a massive reality check. And, you know, I tend to think really big a lot of cases and unrealistically. And, you know, nobody else does that in here, I'm sure. I'm alone in that. But I really had this really big expansive thing that I wanted to do. And I was really unprepared really at that point to communicate all of it through to Cyan at the time we first approached them. And I think that it was that lack of reception that we thought we would get for what we had. And we had a lot of stuff. I mean, the game was big and explorable, and there was a cool, you know, I'd love to do that game someday. But the problem was is that it was just very unrealistic for the size of the team, and the team at the time was pretty much just me, and I was having help from Neal and company at an early stage, and a couple of other people who were giving us help early on. But what it did, though, is that it forced us, and forced me in particular, to look at what I was doing and then to just sit there and fine tune it. How can I chop away all this stuff and make it much more doable as a game? And really, one of the hardest things to do is to let go of things. And I had to let go of a lot of stuff for Zed. And I was being pressured, feeling internal pressure about the fact that I had so many people who had helped us in the Kickstarter, and I didn't want to disappoint them. I had people who helped us in the company and investing a little bit of money in the company, friends and family, and I didn't want to disappoint them as well. And so there were a lot of things that were pressuring me to get the game done, which is part of the impetus behind wanting to keep going and not giving up. Plus, I'm not one to give up on things very easily anyway. But that the fact that Cyan turned us down and a few of other things early on really made me have to think about how can I make this work. And so then, I came up with other ideas and chop. Neal and I got together and we talked about how to make it work. And then Cyan got into the mix and they wanted to do VR. So it suddenly became this big game to suddenly a bunch of small little tiny levels as opposed to 4 big levels, and became a much better story, and we were able to tell a tighter story through it. So sticking with it, actually, if I had given up early on, we would never have gotten the game done, and it would never have become what I think is really remarkable experience. I'm very happy with it personally. And I think that, it was that not giving up, I think, is an important message. And actually in the game itself, the dreamer doesn't give up. The dreamer is continually trying to finish things, that even though he can't remember what it is to finish. And that's sort of the message that, I think I got from it, from originally coming up with the idea and how big I wanted it to be, to then finally narrowing it down to a small, much more palatable actual story to tell it.
Yeah. I think the thing, we talk a lot about the aspect of the dreamer having dementia, but the real aspect is it's an unexamined life, which we can all relate to at some level. And the dementia is that pressure that, if not now, when? Because he's got this ticking time bomb inside of his head where as much as he can try, he may never be able to reconstruct all that stuff. So it really creates this wonderful tension. And when I play the game and the dialogue and all that stuff is there, I still think you wrote it, but you didn't. So you want to talk a little bit about David?
Yeah,
and, your
David
writers?
and Joe. First of all, I brought in Joe Fielder, who is a wonderful writer based out of Boston. And Joe has a long experience in games. And Joe and I worked together at the original sort of framework of the game. He sort of wrote beginning and ending of each chapter. But Joe then wanted to bring in somebody else to help with the middle part, which is David Chen. David Chen is this extremely talented writer. Both Joe's a talented writer too. They're both extremely talented writers. But David came in and took my story, my outline of what I wanted to do, and really fleshed it out. He put meat to the bone that I gave him kind of this skeleton missing parts, and David came in and put all the parts back in and added meat and really added some serious content to the whole story. He brought it to life. And so David Chen was one of these guys who allowed us to be able to tell the story from the standpoint of actually having, making the story even better than I had originally intended to be. Yeah. And with David's help and Joe's help, we hired a guy named Stephen Russell. Anybody ever played Fallout 4? Anybody ever hear that game? Okay, Valentine's voice. That's who our dreamer's voice is. Stephen Russell, and Stephen took David's words and really brought them to life in the game. So obviously, what I'm also trying to say is that it was a very big team effort. We brought a lot of people together who had a lot of passion for the game, and we were pretty happy with that.
That's great. Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
One of the things that I love about the writing is actually the fragments journal, and that kind of came in later in the game.
Yep.
But boy, does it give it depth, right? Like you get
Yep.
that fragment, and now you know a little bit of story behind that fragment. And I again was one of those things that I love that we added in the end. So yeah.
Yeah, because those fragments are the pieces of memory you find to help him start remembering what to do with the final end of the story.
Right. Right. And Neal, we want to give you some compliments here too, because I tell you coming in to the process really you were a great compliment to Chuck's big vision, get it done attitude. You definitely have a get it done attitude, but you also brought a lot of discipline and a lot of structure to it. So you want to talk a little bit about the editorial process that you brought in to get the game to be what it is today?
Yeah, sure. So I think part of the issue of building a game that you're focusing so much on the art is you really need some sort of loop. You can't have a game that it just sort of plops a player in, and I mean, there are games that sort of plop a player in and let them go explore, and they can do whatever they want. But at the end of the day, like if you're trying to advance the story in a way that's meaningful, you have to create some sort of game loop that has ideally some sort of repeatable process. I think it helps a lot. Not that being said, there are some amazing games that are narrative games that are done and completely out of order and do all sorts of really interesting things. But Zed, I don't think it would have fit that category very well. So one of the things that we did was we wanted to figure out what are some game mechanics that work with the idea of memory. So one of them is this fragment journal that Ryan was just talking about. Every time that you find these objects, mystic sort of magic objects within the environment, and you pick them up, there's a journal that adds a new entry, and that journal it's masterfully written. If anyone gets a chance to try it out, read the journal. It might be actually one of the most important parts of the game. And that was David Chen, as well as his writing partner Jeff, they're both amazing. And then the other piece is once you find all of these fragments and you've checked these journal entries, at that point you are actually put at the end of the level with this puzzle. And it's a pretty basic, standard-looking, 9-cube puzzle which you reassemble to unlock the door to exit the level. But what you have to read between the lines, every one of those puzzles, it has an image that is extremely important, and it's only understood at the very end of the game. And then when you realize what you're doing by assembling that puzzle, there's a serious aha moment that I think is just brilliant. A lot of people, when I was watching on Twitch, people were literally in tears playing the game because they had realized the significance of what they were doing by guiding the dreamer through this journey of the mind. So that was really special to be part of being able to help set that up.
That's great. Thanks, Neal. Ryan, you want to talk a little bit about our involvement as a publisher? And obviously we're game designer first, so this is our first foray into actually publishing somebody else's game. So kind of talk about the tension there in terms of wanting to get in and wanting to stand back.
I mean, we've had publishers before, so we know what it's like to publish games, and there's been publishers that, I'm looking at Katie,
Don't look at me.
that, they've come back and said, oh, you need to do it this way, or you need to really stick their hands into it, right? And that's one thing that we didn't want to do. We don't want to change Chuck's story, but there were definitely parts where we're like, we've played it, we've had our QA play it, they weren't getting the beat that needed to be done, so we would go back and say, hey Chuck, can we do something here, and talk to Neal about that, and it was always a good collaborative experience, I felt like anyways, and just even the chapters and changing things, and there have been things that we suggested, we put in, and then we ended up taking out too. So that just, it didn't feel right after we put it in. So as a publisher, which is weird to say, we don't want to take over, but we do want to help where we can. And so Rand was definitely a part of that experience, and saying, yeah, we've kind of down this road. Let's work on some of the wording here, or the script and stuff like that. And I think the ending of the game was one of those places where we were like, we really need to hit this beat. And I think what we got in the end really felt good there.
Yeah, it was real collaborative towards that end, in part.
Yeah.
So
I just want to add in that I work with publishers a lot. We're working on about 8 projects right now, and every one of them has someone who is some major stakeholder. Cyan is hands down one of the best teams that I've worked with, period. Chuck's team as well, but specifically as a publisher, it's very unusual that you get a crew with the level of expertise in part because of the number of years that they've been in the industry. There's very few companies that have been around that long, but also in part because they understand what the goal of the game is. A lot of people, we brought the game around and pitched it to a few different publishers, and there were people who were, they were certainly willing to hop in and fund the project, but no one seemed to get it like Cyan. They right away could understand this is a game about the story of this game is the most important thing. Everything that is constructed must help lean toward that story, and their role was in no way the annoying publisher that's saying this has to be done by this date and this has to be blah 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 blah. No. It was, how can we help you to make sure that your story is told in a way that is as meaningful and impactful as possible, and that's really unusual for a publisher.
And to that end, I mean, that's why we added Jeremiah onto the project too. One of our artists, he came in there, did a lot of the fragments, and it helped you out a bit and stuff like
great.
that. It was,
Yeah, it was really
it
good
was
work.
one of those things that we just wanted to put more of our effort into it too, you know, make sure that it happened. So.
Well, one of the things too is that you guys had like a small focus group kind of look at some things early on.
Yep.
And, you know, at first as a developer, you know, when someone tells you what you're doing, you know, sucks, you actually, your first gut reaction is, what do they know what they're talking about?
Yeah.
But then after, you know, if you're honest with yourself, and really you have to be self-aware, at least self-aware enough to know that you are not making the most perfect thing in the world, you know. And we got some feedback that early on forced me to kind of re-look at how I was making parts of the game. And that feedback really, it stuck with me quite a bit. And Neal and I worked out some of the things with some of that feedback, where I think we managed to get past it and add stuff. I mean, there's the infamous elevator hall that Neal absolutely hated.
Yeah.
You know, Neal just, you know, he says, I can't stand it. I hate this, you know, and so.
Yeah, that'll drive me nuts.
I know. So I came up with something totally different. That's probably the most missed like thing in the entire game, which is the new elevator.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
It's
And but
fantastic.
it actually was something where if somebody really didn't like something, you kind of think to yourself, okay, how can we make this better? You know, and since we didn't really have an art director on the game, since I was the art director, you know, which isn't saying very much sometimes. But you know, I've worked with some really amazing art directors in the past. I do a lot of work for National Geographic as an illustrator, and you want to talk about tough art directors, these guys are really tough. So I had to be really tough on myself and take into consideration what you guys were saying. And I looked at it, and I looked at how the design was, and took the feedback to heart and made these changes that made it a much better game in a lot of ways, I think. And you know, that's where the collaboration comes in, and you really have to throw the ego out the door. You know, I mean, you don't know everything. For me, the most important thing was, as long as it doesn't detract from the story I'm telling. If we can tell that story better, let's get more people involved. And honestly, you know, I think that everybody's feedback made a huge difference in the final product. Everything from Neal and Ryan and Rand and everybody else, and Blake and Kha'tie towards the end. It's just everything. Everybody had something important to say that made it a better product, and so that's important.
So, Kha'tie, one of the challenges we have at Cyan is we have 30 plus years as a developer, but we have about this much time as a publisher,
Right.
and our own publisher, right? So Abduction is really the first game that we ever did on our own. Real Mist kind of counts, but not really, because it's just an extension of our franchise, right? So Abduction was the first new, fresh off the factory floor game and new franchise. So what do you think we can learn? And you work for a lot of different game publishers. What do you think we can learn, and how to better position a Zed or a future game?
And
X?
that's all the time we have. That's such a huge question, because every publisher I've worked with has been so different. And what's weird is, I don't know how to say this diplomatically. Okay, so all of us sitting here remember the days of Cyan being published. And from whatever side we were on, whether we were outside looking in, whether we were working at the evil publisher, whether we were working at Cyan. And one of the things that's carried through, regardless of good decisions, bad decisions, decisions based on money or art or story, is that the people who worked with Cyan on any of the products, whether it was a Mist or Uru or anything since, adore Cyan. They adore the people, they adore the skills, they adore that they're artists, they adore that they're passionate and visionary. And so, yeah, there's always bad guys. You and I both know them. But then there's people like you and hopefully me, and Ryan knows a bunch, and I won't say names, but that their hearts are crushed just as much as you guys or Cyan's when things don't go right or when decisions have to be made. And I know there's a big elephant in the room that we won't name right now, but there, I want you to know there are people inside these big, scary, evil publishers who are in tears in their offices when these decisions are made, who don't want to have to make them. And there's often reasons that they could be technical, they could be financial, and now that you've kind of done it on, and you did it very well, I hope you've had a really good experience with Cyan. I think you have. I know I have. That I can kind of say to you, you know that feeling?
No,
Yeah.
no.
It's out there. There are
making
people
hard
out there.
decisions sucks, but
Yeah.
at the end of the day, I think we just try to get everybody's involvement, and even the future announcements we have for Zed. I mean, just even today, we had our phones out. We're all working on it.
Yeah,
right?
working
going
to
back and
make
forth.
sure-
And we
yeah.
just we want good things happening.
But that's exactly what you were saying, like what can we learn about that positioning? I would say we've learned it. We have that experience. You said it best when you said, having had that experience with publishers, we didn't want to be those guys that came in and said, no, X this and cut that and don't do that. They want to see your vision and make sure we can still get exactly what you want to convey to the people who are in the experience, but do it in a way that makes sure it gets made and make sure that everybody's happy when it's out there. That's what's important.
I'll tell a really funny experience, just because
Oh no.
this tells you how much about publishing we know right now, okay? So the other day I was in a meeting, and we're talking to this other developer, and we're kind of talking contracts, and we're going through it all, and we get to a line, and it says final cut. And everybody in the room is like, final cut, what do you mean? Like the video program? And the developer's looking at us like, no, you get final say. And we're like, no, you're the developer. You get final say. But normally publishers do that. They have the final cut. And we're not that kind of publisher.
There you go.
So, yeah.
I love that.
So Chuck, I think Kha'tie set you up there a little bit. Do you have anything you want to tell us about Zed that's going to happen in the next?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, anybody use Macintosh in here?
Right on.
All right, well, we have the Mac version that's going to be coming out on the App Store on August 15th.
Yep. Yep.
So we'll have it on the App Store on August 15th. And
By August 15th.
it's going to be released on GOG and Steam as a Mac version as well.
Yeah.
And Oculus should be following shortly.
That's right.
Um,
So I will clarify that for Chuck, because we are the evil publisher. Yes, it will be coming out August 15th for Mac. We still
Right.
have to get through Apple's certification
Yeah.
process.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
but other than that,
Other than that, I mean, that's what we're shooting for.
We'll get it out
It's
there.
almost ready to go,
Yeah.
so it's just a matter of Apple now.
Yep.
Yeah.
we're almost out of time. But do we want to take some questions? Does anybody have a question they want to ask Chuck or?
No.
Now's your chance. There we go. Right up there.
So, of all the objects that you spent so much time meticulously putting into Zed, what do you think was your favorite? Whether it was a fragment, I guess you apparently didn't do that fragments that much, but anything else?
It's my
From-
favorite object in
Yeah,
the game?
from any little things.
You probably see it all over the place. It's the moon.
The moon.
It's on his shirt.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the first image I came up with when I started working on Zed. And you find that little image throughout the entire game. And I've recently tribalized it in a more iconic version of it that looks quite a bit, it looks just like that, but it's very even cooler. But as far as objects go, that's probably the object that has been used the most. And for me, it was something that just sort of like, when I started developing Zed, what can I do? And it was originally meant to be a large ride that you jump into its mouth and then ride across to something else. And so that's where it started from. But it's an object that has a lot of meaning to me personally.
Hi. So as an early adopter of VR, I found mostly that narrative games have really kind of taken on like a renaissance because they're well presented in general. But as a developer of VR, do you see it as a challenge that things are moving so quickly in the space? Like with the Valve, with the Index coming out with finger tracking, and like with things moving as fast as they're going, is it challenging for you to keep up with that while also trying to produce content?
On the content side, really isn't all that challenging. I mean, if you're developing anything, I mean, it's challenging, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's really easy and anybody can do it, but content is something that is available regardless of whatever platform you're putting it on. I would have to say, I'm going to guess that just keeping up with all the new stuff is going to be hard, but Neal could answer that question probably a lot more succinctly.
Yeah,
He's the guy who
it's
does
pretty
it.
tricky. What's funny is the speed of graphics cards, it sort of isn't determining the future of VR right now. If you actually look at what the most sort of the successful VR devices, they're the ones that run on the worst hardware. The Quest and the PlayStation 4 are great examples. So it's sort of funny because you have to think about making your game for the minimum spec, and then as new technologies emerge, like the Knuckles, for example, you hope that the next spec for the next device that comes out is better or more performant, and then you also have to worry about integrating all those new controls or peripherals. So every time something new comes out, there's someone yelling, please add this support for this, and then you have to make the determination like how fast you're going to be able to get that taken care of. So it's very challenging in that sense.
You can actually ask that question to the devs in the next panel, because I mean we're seeing that with abduction, like knuckle support, index support, mixed reality. It's this last update that was pain.
That was a good time.
Yeah.
So much of the promotional material shows like the really surrealistic landscapes, and that's a part of the game that you spend very little time in. And maybe I wasn't paying enough attention going through it, but I didn't see much connection between some of those images and the other stuff in the game. Was that originally supposed to be something that you did explore more and had more connection with that? As part that I just don't understand very much.
Well, the parts of the story I started developing once we had the writing down. I started looking at what the narrative was for these various elements, and I tried to tie the narrative more to where the dreamer is thinking about, talking about as far as the narrative. So if you're in the house, he's talking about things that relate to the house and to the artwork. Once you get out to some of the areas like the big city area, or you're in one of the caves, the elements that are discussed in the narrative tend to be more specifically oriented towards those areas. So it's like when you go into the cityscape, he's talking about LSD and also about that this isn't something from our from my imagination. Where did this come from? We were trying to kind of give you an impression that the dreams, like my dreams can be very mundane at times, and then sometimes they're so like out there that I wake up and I have to kind of pinch myself to see where I'm at. So I try to reflect a little bit about what, at least the way I interpret dreams to be, into how the game is presented from a visual way. And the original ideas behind the games with the larger landscapes were tied directly to some dreams that I had had that were very much larger. And I did want to have those big spaces in the original game that were more explorable. And as we were talking about earlier, as far as the VR aspect, we had to reduce the size of them to fit within the context of making sure that we could tell that story in VR. But most of everything in the game that's designed around the narrative, the environments reflect the narrative pretty specifically.
I think that's actually a really good question and something we should make note of, because it's, again, as we started off with this idea, let's emphasize the more amazing scenes, right? I mean, that's what we do with our stuff. But I think, again, that might have been a misstep with our first pancake here. And and that we are kind of not misleading, but kind of alluding to something that we don't really mean to say right now, which is it's not these big things, it's this intimate narrative story. So I appreciate that question.
Yeah, plus, I think that we didn't want to be compared too much to Gone Home and a few other different games that utilize interior space of a room or a house, because the game is much bigger than just those places. I wanted to be able to tell the story that there is much more to this man's dreams. That's why we went from big neighborhoods and small rooms and big open expanses into that rotating central structure. There's some visual symbolism that goes along with some of that as well. And so that's why there may be a bit of an initial disconnect, but if you listen to the narrative talking about those places, it starts to make more sense.
One more question, and then we have to finish up.
I was just wondering, you were saying how Cyan had things, it's hard to be told you suck, What were the things that maybe they told you in the first year going, hey, but then go, that's great, I hadn't thought of that.
One of the things that they thought of, yeah, we said, hey, I wish I'd thought of that.
No, the other way around.
Oh, the other way around.
Yeah.
Boy, we were all pretty much on the same page for the most part. Most of it was I would develop something, send it to them, and then they would react to it. And when it came to building the levels and building the world, I think that they reacted to the construction of each of the place as its own character almost. And I think that's where you had most of your reaction to, is where the places were at and the ideas and how we were telling the story. I mean, I'd like to say that the puzzle idea, to get from level to level was pretty much my idea, along with working with Neal, trying to figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
But I think that some of the things that they really liked were the book, for instance, at the end, the children's book.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
one, just to answer real quick, Ryan, you want to just talk about the beginning? Because we thought we knew a better way to start it. And,
Yeah.
and then it was like, and
now I'm
then-
trying to remember
Yeah,
everything with that.
Well,
Go ahead.
So it's when you get the voiceover. I think it was the voiceover timing,
Yeah.
because you're just kind of when you're dropped into this world, the very first place you are is an empty room, and you're kind of trying to figure out where you are and why you're there, and also what's happening. And there's a voiceover that used to start before you got into the room, and I think it was that we waited until a little bit after, so that you kind of get your bearings before you start getting pelted with
Narrative.
auditory memories. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's what you're talking about, because otherwise it doesn't gel with what you've just heard, and then suddenly you're in a room. But if you're already there, it made more
Yes.
sense. Was
yeah, that's
that
one of
it?
the places where we made a change, that the original way we had done it was the way that we ended up using.
Yep.
And because Cyan wanted to see something a little bit more
Right.
leading into that room, that, we had a couple quotes on the screen, and we tried a couple of different ways, but
Yep.
it just got back to the original idea that we had was what
It
actually worked.
looked really cool, but it
Yeah.
was super
Yeah, it
confusing
didn't-
and
Yeah,
didn't make
it was
sense.
it's super confusing, and when you have to,
Right.
you're playing a game and you have to start thinking, I'm going to go get a cup of coffee right now while this is figuring out what I got to do next, kind of.
Yeah.
Kind of
Yeah.
like, let's not do that, But,
Yeah, it pulled you out of it a bit.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well, we are out of time. I want to thank you all for
next game.
listening to us. The next panel up is the devs from
from the
Cyan,
devs.
and Chuck will also be here. And I want to thank my panel, Chuck, Neal, Kha'tie, Ryan. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.